Resident Evil 4 defined the horror genre, and to this day it's one of the greatest games ever released. And with the remake just right around the corner, let's take a look at why Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest Resident Evil games of all time. So I think one of the areas that helps Resident Evil 4 stand out as the best Resident Evil game has to deal with the story. Now, the story of Resident Evil holds a slight similarity to it. It's probably something that you've experienced before, either in other Resident Evil games at the time, or maybe even just other horror games. However, it has an essence to it that feels very unique in its presentation, as it thrusts you right into the thick of a dangerous situation as the one and only Leon Kennedy. Now, we've played as him before in previous Resident Evil games, specifically Resident Evil 2. However, this time around, he is a US special agent tasked with rescuing the president's daughter who's been kidnapped. I love that this game immerses you so quickly into things, specifically the village sequence, which if you've experienced it before, played the original, or maybe even just played the demo, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It really just gets you into the thick of things and makes you realize just how intense this game is going to be off the jump, offering you a true taste of what's to come. And it is within that nonstop adrenaline rush that you really begin to drown into the plot, the characters, and sometimes the cheesiness of it all. Now, speaking of cheesiness, one area that this game excels in lies in its ability to balance both tense situations and moments with kind of cheesiness and the typical one-liners that you might expect from Resident Evil game. Have you played Resident Evil 3? You know exactly what I'm talking about. This game can be very cheesy, but there's a kind of charm in that. And in many ways, it feels truly Resident Evil, if you know what I mean. I always reference Leon Kennedy as that sort of action hero that's kind of too old for this shit when he's tasked with a dangerous mission. Now, the damsel in distress in this game, Ashley Johnson, does a good job of balancing the game's tense situations as well. She actually provides quite a bit of levity to things. Once again, referring to the balance that I was speaking of before. She's just a young girl that's found herself in a wildly creepy situation and looking to Leon to do his job and protect her. And I remember playing the game back in 05 and thinking she kind of came off as a little entitled, but by the end of our journey together, I actually came to be really fond of Ashley and Leon's, character dynamics. This unlikely combination adds a great deal of depth to the story versus what we had come to see in the likes of previous Resident Evil games. And that's just what I love about the story. I love that it's relatable, but it takes a very, kind of protector feel. It's similar to what we've seen in games that have released since then, in like God of War. We've seen it in, The Last of Us. And those are some of my favorite games of all time. I think it just adds such a level of risk and reward, a level of tension to the game when you're not only tasked with protecting yourself as the main protagonist, but you're also tasked with protecting someone who is more or less defenseless. Now let's talk about the mechanics. So when we talk about other Resident Evil games, one area that I think Resident Evil 4 completely excels beyond its predecessors has to be in the mechanics. Now, where the other Resident Evil games, specifically Resident Evil, 1, 2, and 3, took a very tanky, very slow-paced, top-down, room-to-room approach, I really like how Resident Evil 4 did something that we hadn't really seen in a lot of survival horror games, and that was the over-the-shoulder approach. Now, the over-the-shoulder approach is something that we've seen in just about every third-person game since then, but I really credit Resident Evil 4 as being kind of the catalyst to start things. And while you may not know it now, because I'm sure for many of you, many gamers out there, over-the-shoulder, third-person viewing is very much kind of the norm. But back then, this was a very wildly huge change of pace and really immersed you in the game as you kind of stood right behind the main character as all this danger is coming at you. And it just added such a level of tension that I to this day, I remember experiencing for the first time, being like, man, this is different. I remember having the sweatiest of palms as villagers with hatchets, axes, and chainsaws chased after me. And oh man, the sound of those chainsaws still haunt me to this day. And in many ways, I truly credit Resident Evil 4 as being the blueprint for what we've seen in so many other games. Next up, number 3, we got to talk about the characters. And oh man, Resident Evil 4 has such a wild cast of characters, not just talking about Leon, not just talking about Ashley, or even the main, villains that we encountered throughout the game and the bosses, but also just the NPCs, specifically the merchant. The NPCs in this game have to be some of the most memorable of any game that I've ever played in the horror genre. Going back to what I was saying about cheesiness, we find ourselves occasionally running into the merchant, a mysterious fellow who randomly appears, would ask you, what are you buying? And then sell us shit. It was amazing. It was the most random, most RE thing I could have never knew that I needed, and to this day, I am forever thankful for it. They made memes of this guy, like he had, They made memes of this guy, and in many ways, I credit him as being one of the main heroes for Resident Evil 4. And I'm so glad that he's coming back in the Resident Evil 4 remake, and I cannot wait to buy more weapons from this guy and hear him say his classic one-liner once again. Like I said, Resident Evil 4 was not afraid to have a little fun, was not afraid to make fun of itself at times, and to charm the player. And I think that it's that kind of balance that I really think helped this game stand out against others, as it really invited players who may have not even been fans of the horror genre into this experience. This is something that other Resident Evil games didn't really do as well, that I think, coming into Resident Evil 4 back in 2005, I think it was a real solid change of pace, not only for Capcom and for the Resident Evil 4 franchise, but just in terms of games and storytelling in general, that you don't have to take yourself too seriously. The game doesn't always have to be so rigid, so strict, so serious. There are moments where you can have a little fun, and I always credit Resident Evil 4, and I always appreciated their ability to kind of, be able to just have a little fun with things. Next up, we got to go with number 4, and that is the environment. So previous Resident Evil games really kept you, for the most part, confined to dark corridors and narrow hallways with not nearly enough lighting. However, one thing I think many players, including myself, really appreciated was the opportunity coming into Resident Evil 4 to really explore a more outdoorsy rural space. No more hallways. I'm not saying that things completely open up, as Resident Evil 4, for the most part, is still relatively a linear experience compared to what Capcom has done, in the future. However, the change in environment truly added a spice to a series that desperately needed it. Something about being chased in a wide open environment almost felt more confining, and I loved that sense of duality there, where we could be in an open space. However, your options were still limited, ammo was still running low, and you still had to figure out creative ways to dip and dodge past all of these enemies when you found yourself to simply be outnumbered. It's hard to explain, but I've always appreciated Resident Evil 4 for the ability to change up the environment, offer you new opportunities to tackle challenges, and really create a sense of depth within the combat and game overall. This is something that I haven't seen done that well in previous entries, but Resident Evil 4, in my personal opinion, absolutely nailed it. And number 5, we gotta go with the challenge. In Resident Evil 4, the stakes are higher than they ever have been, because you're not only required and tasked with protecting yourself as a character with limited ammo and resources, but once you find yourself rescuing Ashley Johnson, who's the main, other main protagonist in the game, you now have to tend and multitask with not only protecting yourself, but also protecting someone who is relatively defenseless. And this is where things become not only more dangerous, but the stakes just become higher. And that added tension to a survival horror game is just an element that I cannot get enough of. I simply love the tension that this added to the game and presented both some interesting solutions to puzzles and also some unique challenges to tackle as well. And speaking of challenge, Resident Evil 4 provided one of the most diverse cast of characters, villains, and bosses. No more running from an experiment that's simply unkillable. While I did enjoy that to some degree, in the previous Resident Evil games, there was something nice about not running for your life in the dark, narrow hallways from someone that simply cannot be taken down. Now, while I'm sure you might be sensing some frustration from me, you're right. It was cute in the moment, but let's be honest, I simply got so annoyed at, towards the later parts of the game when I'm simply just trying to get that last little bit of shotgun ammo that I left behind for a special occasion, and I end up having to waste it on an enemy that gets in my way, that I simply cannot kill. Needless to say, I like that the creators of the original Resident Evil game weren't afraid to mix things up in a way with, new dense enemy variety. And that's something that I just loved, that I think Resident Evil 4 excelled in so well, is it not only did it have a stronger story, a more relatable, connecting story for, new and returning players, but it also just had higher stakes, difficulty was there, the environment also simultaneously opened up, but created, much more tense situations for you, which is something that we hadn't seen in a Resident Evil, title before. And overall, all these elements combined together to create just such a beautiful survival horror experience, one that I think a lot of fans have really held on to close to their heart even after all these years. Resident Evil 4 takes so much of what made the franchise popular in previous entries, doubles down on what worked, changed what didn't, and invents something that has been the benchmark for horror games for millions of gamers for years. Now that we have a chance to revisit this iconic game with a fresh new coat of paint, I cannot be more excited to see what additions they've made to the game to fit more of a modern landscape of gaming. Needless to say, Resident Evil 4 is without a doubt Capcom's crowning achievement, and if this doesn't convince you to give it a try or even jump back in, I don't know what will. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you're as excited as I am to shoot the heads of some infected villagers and be in just one of the most intense gaming horror experiences to ever release, be sure to subscribe to the channel, as I'll be posting my full playthrough, or check out our live playthrough over on Twitch. All the links to that you can find on my channel page. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if you're going to be jumping into Resident Evil 4 Remake for yourself on day one, and if this is going to be your first time. I would love to hear what you're most excited about, or what drew you to jumping into this game for the first time. I mean, this is going to be an incredible experience. I think if this is your first time, you're definitely not going to be disappointed. And if you're returning again, I think it's going to be a beautiful sense of nostalgia being able to experience this game, like I said, with a new fresh coat of paint, new mechanics, and all the stuff that we can come to expect in here. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Drop a like on this video if you do enjoy. Subscribe if you're new here. We'd love to have you. As for me, I'm going to prepare to revisit one of my favorite games of all time. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.